The Winter Latina Show.
Hosted by IDM.
Yeah, my camera is in the wrong place. Hello, Nina. Hello, everybody. Hello, Duckling. We have someone watching. That's cool.
Welcome to another fun-filled episode of the Winter Latina Show, where people who are barely able to speak, i.e. your host, yours truly, who has water and some cough medicine, is still showing up because I know that you're waiting for this with bated breath. Or maybe not, maybe no one's watching, but hello everyone, welcome to this episode. And of course, today is April 4th. It is the birthday of the best defense alliance in the world, NATO. Obviously, that's a huge euphemism. So happy birthday to everyone who was born on April 4th, except for NATO. Now, we're going to get into our topic today, which is actually a very heavy subject. I was kind of debating whether or not to talk about it. And of course, this topic was inspired, right, motivated by the horrific attack that took place in Russia on March 22nd. It was outside of Moscow, right, in Krasnogorsk. Obviously, it made international headlines. There's been some controversies about the Crocus City Hall attack. And Marcelo, once again, before we get started, I'm kind of curious, what kind of coverage did you see in Europe? Now, of course, I can see some European headlines as well, but you probably see them a little bit more readily. They're probably popping up on your phone. So what did you see about this attack?
Well, actually, not much of that popped out in my phone, to be true. So Google does not filter well my researches.
Interesting.
Well, yeah, I've been following mostly by the usual channels, Slaviangrad and the alternative press, let's call it like that.
Right.
Yeah, but no. The main press, the mainstream press is it's really not talking that much. Yeah, there's been a terrorist attack, and the United States have told the Russians that it could have happened, but no, not much coverage and not many details actually from Western.
Well, there was one
media.
detail that was released very quickly, just as the details were unfolding. Western media and certain politicians from the official West laid blame on, the so-called Islamic State K, right, from Central Asia, which was very interesting because, something like the Nord Stream sabotage from a couple years ago is still a mystery, yet this particular act of terrorism was being blamed on this organization before we even had the details, we had the information, before the suspects were even apprehended. In some cases, there was that kind of speculation. So I thought that was kind of an interesting angle to something that was an absolutely awful event. Mm-hmm.
That actually took a couple of days, but the first amazing information is that Ukraine didn't do it.
Well, of course.
That was the first one.
What I was seeing on my end, it was less than 24 hours. There was that speculation happening. And of course, details were still coming out. And the details were horrific, right? The death toll kept climbing from, dozens to, I think right now it's over 140. Some are still missing. And of course, there are hundreds of people who were injured. This was a large venue, right? A concert venue where people came to see an orchestra, families with children, a very sort of family-friendly event. And there were
Blake videos.
Exactly. And there were these people that basically came to massacre, right? And there were sort of the Russian state stated that there were 11 suspects, 4 of which were the immediate perpetrators, right? And they were captured on the way out to Ukraine, which is the first sort of the first time that we heard about the Ukrainian connection as the details were still unfolding. So obviously the scale was absolutely immense. It was compared to some of the worst acts of terrorism in Russia, in post-Soviet Russia, so modern Russia. And it was compared to 2 acts of terrorism. One of them was the Beslan school hostage crisis, which took place during the Second Chechen War, the early 2000s. And the other one was same time. It was called, well, it has 2 names. I call it, or Russians call it Nord-Ost. But I think in English, they also refer to it as the Moscow, it's labeled as Moscow theater hostage crisis in 2002, right? So we have the school situation in 2004 and the theater situation, which of course, because of the venue is the closest comparison, was in 2002. And in both of those cases, we'll talk about them in a little bit more detail. The death toll was horrific as well. And of course, these are, as civilian as it gets as far as hostages go. But the first thing that pops into my mind when I see a comparison like that is that, for instance, in the theater hostage crisis, this was a hostage situation. The perpetrators had demands to the Russian government. Now, the demands were sort of not something that could be fulfilled because they were seeking to basically stop the hostilities with the Chechen situation in the early 2000s, which, you can't just do that overnight. But, hostage crises typically have some kind of demands, right? Whereas in this case, in the case of a March 22nd attack, there were no demands. These people just came there to perpetrate a massacre. That was sort of the key point. So if you look at the history of terrorism Russia in, let's say from the 90s up until now, I would kind of generally put it into 2 categories. There were some suicide attacks. Right now, of course, suicide attacks are meant to make some kind of a statement as well, especially once the names of the perpetrators become known. And of course, they're supposed to sow maximum terror. Or these types of hostage situations where there is some kind of a demand going to the government, which is why this particular 2024 situation was very, very different. And so I think in that sense, the connection to Ukraine, whether or not it exists, I mean, there's the obvious connection that these people were fleeing to the still federally recognized border of Ukraine, even though technically some of those territories may be considered part of Russia, but not internationally recognized. So, it's kind of hard not to ask the very, very obvious question, even if you're a complete, layman on the street, know nothing about global politics, and you see the news, you would ask, okay, well, why are they heading in this direction? Why aren't they heading somewhere else? And statements have been made that, for instance, the head of the Russian intelligence made statements that they would have been met there with open arms as heroes. Now, he is the head of intelligence services. I mean, I guess you can take his statements with a grain of salt, but something tells me that he has some. He took a few days before he made these statements, so something tells me he did come across some very specific information before he could make a public statement like this. So what is your perception about accusations of this nature versus the complete denials before information even comes out, coming from the Western media echo chamber?
Well, yeah, that's the first point. I think you cover most of the important points. So first of all, when you have something called modus operandi. So when people act, they usually act in a certain way because of certain variables that constrain them to work in this way. So as you mentioned, there is no demands, there is no it's just a simple attack, create chaos, and
maximum damage, right?
Maximum damage
to
as possible.
the structure. Remember, there was that massive fire as well as a result of this, and of course, maximum damage to human life as well.
So the first point is that. So the usual modus operandi of that, and then we can get let's get out of Russia. Let's talk about the Bataclan attacks in Paris, which, by the way, I was in Paris in that day.
Oh wow!
Yeah, and so the thing is, it's very simple. These people go. They create the maximum damage as possible, and they are usually auto-martyrized by at some point during or after, or in case they are about to get caught. And that's what happened in the Bataclan, not only during the attacks, but also after, when the French police was about to find other suspects. I remember I was still there, and I was listening to the news, and they were closing everything with the risks of people around. And one woman that was found, she self-exited in a very dramatic way. Let's put it like that, as YouTube likes. So that didn't happen. And as you mentioned, the guys also did not make hostages and demands. So
no, and
which
of course
would
there's
be
a
the
lot
other
of conflicting information about this, but based on some of these media reports, right, take them with a grain of salt. There are all these Telegram channels that were uncovered. These people were supposedly paid certain amount of money and promised more money. So this was literally like a hitman type situation, except on a mass kill scale, which is really unlike anything that we've seen with, again, the modern cases of terrorism in Russia since 1991. So do you see other parallels or perhaps differences with the Bataclan theater because obviously it's a venue, right? So that's a close comparison.
It's very alike. It's very alike. The way they operate, it's very alike. Just go in, shoot, kill, and if possible, get out. But if it's not possible, well, don't get out.
But it didn't seem like in the Russian case that these perpetrators had any desire to self-exit, like the more motivated perpetrators in France. So that was also very interesting. That's the point.
And I mentioned the lady that was captured days later, exactly because of that. Because when you see the images of the Russian police capturing these guys, they were not ready to just blow up. They were not ready. They were not prepared for that.
These Rambos who are slaughtering people in real life instead of a movie to being these babies, right, who were not expecting to be captured because they're so close as well to their destination. And it was that contrast was also very, very interesting. And it says a lot also about who they were. At least I actually kind of stayed away from watching too many of those interrogation videos, but the inability to speak Russian language, it did seem like these people were not ideological, which of course, if you're working for the so-called Islamic State or some other highly political, ideological, quasi-religious organization, you have to be very, very inspired in that way. And of course, this is the thing that makes you motivated to self-exit, like you're saying. In this case, these people, if they're essentially doing it for money, which it seemed to be, rather being primarily inspired by ideology, politics, some kind of a religious interpretation that's skewed, then again, that is this really striking contrast. And if you have that, then how can you not have questions about the puppet masters of something of this caliber? It's sort of like, again, even if you're this, layman on the street, and by no means am I an expert on terrorism, but this is sort of the obvious question that should enter anyone's mind who has, two brain cells capable of sparking a single thought. Hopefully, if you see that kind of news, like this is the question you should ask. And so, yeah, all those comparisons to the earlier cases of terrorism can only really be made in terms of the scale and the damage to civilians and the type of civilians that were harmed, right? Women, children, just like the absolute no-no. And, beyond that, it's really different.
Yeah, so we had this conversation with Lucas Laroche from the New Resistance here the last weekend, and one of the aspects that he was mentioning is that, so you have this moderate revolutionary arms being created and pumped with the United States some years ago, and then you have the spin-offs from that, like you had the ISIS being created, being born on that. And after some time, well, maybe these armies are not well fed anymore. So these people just become mercenaries. It's not ideological anymore. So if it's not ideological, so first of all, there's a big narrative problem there. Why? So first of all, why? Why would Islamic extremists attack Russia? Because as far as we understand, the Chechen wars are long gone. The Chechens are right now being extremely useful and useful to the Russian army on the Ukrainian special military operation. And so I think, in my perception, an outsider, it looks to me that, the big issue, the big Islamic issue, let's call it like that. It's not, the issue is not the Islam, is the social problem that it may have had been some time ago, has been solved, has been, we have Islam in our country, and it's all right, and they are all right living in a country that is...
the other thing that's been mentioned is that it could be linked to Syria, but of course the height of Russian involvement in Syria was several years prior, and
I'm about to get there, exactly.
There was an attack, the anniversary...
That's the narrative problem.
Right. The anniversary of a 2017 attack in St. Petersburg, it was, the metro bombings, the subway bombings passed yesterday. And of course, at the time, it seemed like it was quite mass scale. Now, it's weird to compare death tolls. Obviously, a subway is kind of its own special hell if you think about this type of a situation where you're in a confined space underground, right? But basically, it was a suicide bomber, and are we even allowed to use that term? I guess I should say self-exiting bomber in the subway, and it was literally right in April 2017, right, April 1st. So this day has passed yesterday, and he was a Russian citizen of Central Asian descent. So he was born in Central Asia, but he received a Russian citizenship, and I think the death toll was 15 people, plus, of course, the man who took himself out in this way, and over 100 people were wounded. So again, very, very mass scale. If you think about the idea of being in a confined space on a subway underground, right, it's really terrifying, and that really brought sort of memories of previous attacks, because there were other bombings in Moscow, right, in the subway. So this was St. Petersburg. Moscow was 2010, and that one was pretty massive. The death toll was also quite large. It was over 40 people. And then there were two sort of back-to-back bombings in 2004, but of course that was, in the middle of the Second Chechen War, right? So there are two subway stations that were attacked months apart from each other by people who took themselves out as they perpetrated these facts. So again, the comparison between as you're saying, context. The one was sort of linked to the Chechen war. The St. Petersburg one is a little bit iffy in terms of like, was it really linked to Syria? Was it not linked to Syria? I've seen all kinds of conflicting information about that, but at least in terms of the modus operandi, like you're saying, these people were very, very motivated to take themselves out as they took lots of other people out. So, very, very different compared to the Crocus City Hall situation. And so making some kind of a parallel to Russian involvement in Syria that has kind of really wound down is very, very problematic. So then that's not really working. And
that's a point where I wanted to go about the narrative problem. Is that, well, I mentioned this a couple of times here in the channel. When I moved from Brazil to Europe, it was 2015. So when I was in Brazil, Russia was working together with the United States to fight ISIS. And, well, all right, makes sense. War on terror, everybody's on board, all that. But when I arrived in Switzerland, Russia was bombing Damascus. You understand the very simple difference in the narrative.
Yeah.
So the Russians were fighting against terror, and one day later they were, midnight one, they were bombing Damascus. They were attacking Syria, and that was it was my first, well, my second actually, wake up call for geopolitics.
Right.
And that's
Russians were on the
problem.
side of the government forces, right? It's
yeah.
I mean, you still see those narratives here and there. They've definitely died down compared to, what they're like 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. But it's pretty amazing how you can just reframe what's actually happening and have a very clear case of Russia being invited by the legitimate government of a country to help resolve a horrifying situation with radicalism and terrorism, some of which is being funded by foreign countries, multiple foreign countries. And and you could just kind of tweak the phrasing, and it's about Russia attacking Syria, which is, of course, I think this might have been a wake-up call for other people as well, in terms of people who are actually watching that situation unfold, and they might have realized how things can be reframed to completely switch your perception of, the actual situation on the ground. So, But
Exactly.
also, of course, if you think about whom the so-called Islamic State attacks and whom it doesn't attack, you can also have questions about that. Like, wouldn't such and such country be an obvious target, but yet it never happens, right? So then I know there are lots of tinfoil hat theories about that particular organization, which, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but it's definitely a question that would arise as well, because you always want to ask, whom does this benefit? Whom are they attacking? Like, really very basic questions about, the modus operandi of an organization like that, right? That's supposed to be sort of the worst and the most terrifying terrorist organization in the world today, right? So that's another interesting question. But again, even if things were clearer, let's say even if it had some connection to Syria, normally in a crime, including a terrorist attack, there should be some kind of an investigation, and that investigation takes, a certain amount of time. So the fact that you would be having these headlines, and most certainly Kyiv had nothing to do with it, it's almost like, again, it's this like the lady doth protest too much kind of scenario. Even yesterday there was, I posted about this on Twitter/X. There was a phone call at the highest levels between the Russian defense minister and the French defense minister. And I think France, who knows if this is a game or they're backing down from their threats of bringing actual NATO troops into Ukraine, but they're sort of discussing cooperation and possibly even relaunching negotiations. But they were talking about the war. But as part of that conversation, the French Minister of Defense said, by the way, Ukraine had nothing to do with this terrorist attack, and I'm really sorry that it happened. And so It's just you now have phone calls going to the Russian government that are being initiated by European governments, because this was initiated by the French side, trying to drive down the point. And it's just like, again, what is the purpose of overly stressing it? Do you not think that Russia has its own ways of investigating something like this? And
it's just absurd to punch a point that, well, first of all, you have not, that's quote unquote here, air quotes, you have nothing to do with it. I mean, if this guy would be saying, well, France has nothing to do with that, and we will give you support for finding out whatever. They're not saying that. The United States is not saying that. They're saying, well, Ukraine has nothing to do. Well, are you the government of Ukraine? Are you the
well, but it's like, how much do you know? How much control do you have over that country, right? So
give me the receipts. Yeah. How much? Why? How do you know that? Are you the owner of the government?
Well, either you're completely in control of the government, which says a lot about the puppet state that Ukraine may be, right? Or you simply don't know. But, if we look at Kyiv's modus operandi, we've had, drone attacks on civilian buildings in Moscow. There was one failed attack on the Kremlin. So again, they have been targeting some infrastructure that is right.
Belgorod being shot daily, in a daily basis.
Striking Donbass since 2014. Again, going after specifically civilian targets like shopping malls, parks, like public places on a weekend to create maximum damage. Now, that actually kind of sounds like attacking a big, venue where families are attending to watch a performance on a weekend. Actually kind of sounds within those same parameters. And I'm not saying, Kyiv did it, because I'm not the Russian intelligence, but in terms of causing an attack and causing maximum damage to the civilian population, it's completely in line with that. Even when they attacked the Crimean bridge, the Kerch bridge, the initial attack killed a family. It wasn't, they weren't attacking some oil tanker or something like that, or some military machinery being moved, and then you could say, yes, they're defending themselves, they're striking, arms that are being moved, blah, 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 blah. Okay, fine. They're striking a family and killing a child. So is that not considered an act of terrorism? I mean,
the Kerch Bridge, one could argue. The Kerch Bridge, one could argument that, it's a military target, although it's not very important, but it is an infrastructure target that could be used as military. But you have the assassination of Daria Dugina, you have the assassination of the other reporter that I forgot the name now, and they were all kind of confessed by Budanov, and recently by the other guy that I also forgot the name. Well, Slavic names is not my easy everyday thing. If there was a Souza or a Soares, that would be easy.
Pardon me. The fact that they're making these insinuations in public, again, about people who are not connected to the military, right, is very, very telling. And they've been going out, again, assuming they were the ones behind those assassinations, they're going after thinkers, right? They assassinated, Vadim, well, I think it was his pseudonym, but, right. So they went after him, who was, he was a journalist in a war zone. Daria Dugina was obviously an opinion maker, an intellectual, again, someone who would be, or would have been even more important in terms of informing the Russian society, having access to the media. They went after the modern famous Russian writer Prilepin, who survived. So again, these are sort of opinion makers, people who are able to impact large groups of people in the Russian language. So they're really thinking, they're not really targeting, in that sense, like you're saying, military personnel, military infrastructure. They're going after people that would somehow impact your opinion in their mind, right? So that's also very, very telling. But sometimes if they're trying to use a drone against a normal apartment building, I mean, those are probably not opinion makers. They're probably just regular people living in that building, right? And then
or a town square or a market.
Right, exactly. That's as far as the Moscow or the Moscow region, and then of course, yes, Belgorod being the sort of the borderland city, and of course Donbass itself that has been struck for we're essentially in 10 years of that city experiencing this nightmare. Again, predominantly civilian targets, children, shopping malls, bakeries, hotels. So it's really that modus operandi of causing maximum damage. Now, of course, it's not necessarily masked gunmen, right, running into those places. It's shelling, which is why, the Russian air defense cannot prevent it. And which is why that particular area was so important, to move the ability to shell the city farther, which has been unfortunately very slow. But yeah, it's the idea of causing maximum terror by going after civilians that is completely in line with what Kyiv has been doing with the support of, sometimes public support of, let's say, Britain. You would see headlines coming from Britain encouraging Kyiv. So if you see that in public, God knows what's going on behind the scenes. And, again, it's a speculation, but it's like, these are your public statements. So yep. What else could we conclude? And yes, of course, this particular investigation isn't over, but I don't think Russian officials would be throwing out those accusations, because I think the trajectory in the Western media is like, well, they're trying to garner more support for the war in Ukraine. It's like, well, they already have it. There are people volunteering in the army. They re-elected Putin. Like, you couldn't possibly have any more support. And not only that, if you actually look at the social mood, people for now, essentially since the beginning of this thing, but I would say sort of maybe halfway into that, maybe since like late 2022, have been saying, Russia has been really not taking off its gloves in this particular case. It's been really because of the limitations of the legal definition of what a special military operation is. And again, just for Westerners, it's not like Russia can't use the word war. We've been using it for 10 years, right? In the media, etc. It's more like there are particular legal parameters to what that is versus, let's say, an anti-terrorist operation that has special legal parameters as well. Versus war would have very different legal parameters. So for Russia using that terminology, it was about, pardon me, it was about those particular legal limitations, which may or may not be lifted. But yeah, I mean, the Russian public has been very kind of asking questions, why not do more? So you don't need that support by having an act like that, basically, is what I'm saying.
So that brings me to a question. Do you think that this could have motivated the attacks? I mean, trying to fish Russia into changing the special military operation status to an anti-terrorist operation, because they haven't done yet, and they had multiple opportunities to do so. I mean, there was one time that was 1 minute to midnight, and they were already talking about the idea to change the special military. Yeah. So they were almost changing to, or it was floating the idea of changing the special military operation to an anti-terrorist framework.
I thought it would happen earlier personally because of the previous incidents. I guess, of course, they were not on the same mass scale, but again, it's the question of, yes, there are red lines, but these red lines exist in a time continuum. So, yesterday might not have been the right time, but tomorrow will be. So obviously, we're just observers looking at these actions, from the outside. So it's really kind of difficult to see what information, let's say, the Russian government and the, Ministry of Defense has, and at what point they might consider this being, okay, this is the red line, but also the time is right. Because if you think about the situation in Donbass, right, lots of people say Russia should have intervened in 2014 instead of 2022. And of course, the biggest counter argument was that it was not ready in terms of the financial implications, sanctions, et cetera, that would have been implemented. And it took Russia a while to prepare for that. So I think this is, I think it's a difficult question. It's a matter of, it's a question, yes, of course, it's a red line if Kyiv was involved, if someone else was involved, but it's also a matter of the timing. And it's not clear to me whether the timing is right or not. So, there's all this, it's a very dynamic situation. So on the one hand, you have France threatening to send troops. On the other hand, Macron is wanting to help with obtaining more information about this act of terrorism. And yet, on the third hand, right, we're running out of hands here. We have these phone calls, between the defense ministers, perhaps discussing possible peace settlements, right? So it's a really, it's really kind of hard to come to a conclusion about this when those things are being thrown out in public. And of course, then you're like, is this actually what's happening, or is this being given to the public for a show, right? So perhaps it's again us being kind of skeptical and questioning everything we see, which I think is kind of helpful, but sometimes maybe we go too far. It might be one of those as well. So I'm not really convinced that would really change the situation. But the fact that the Russian officials, like the head of the intelligence services, Bortnikov, made statements like there is that foreign connection and it's not ISIS. I don't think he would be publicly making statements like that, knowing that they would immediately be translated into, 100 languages. If he didn't have some really particular kind of information, if he didn't weigh his words prior to issuing them, whether it's a sort of like, that we know, and we know that whether it's just that kind of a situation or whether some actions would be taken by the Russian government, right? It's really kind of hard to tell. So it's a really kind of a difficult question. But I think I really wanted to quickly jump into the pre-imperial era because Russia is one of those, because people think of terrorism as this kind of modern phenomenon. And of course, when you think about non-state actors perpetrating these acts, in that sense, it is a modern phenomenon, right? That's kind of the scary part about it, is that it could be, it could be anyone, it could be anywhere, right? And the purpose of it is causing maximum terror. But Russia is actually not new, unfortunately, to that phenomenon. And the late 19th century going up until, the Russian Revolution was just absolutely filled with either successful acts of terrorism or attempts on people. But the interesting thing about that is that it was mainly targeting high-ranking politicians all the way up to the Tsar, right? So this was not about, again, we can sort of draw that really big distinction between modern terrorism, where you have non-state actors trying to perpetrate maximum terror in terms of going after the civilian population, versus the late 19th, early 20th century with these self-proclaimed revolutionaries, and they belong to different organizations. So for instance, one, probably the most famous example is the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881. And his assassins were linked to a radical organization called People's Will, right? Народная воля. And so, and this was not the first attempt on his life as well. And it was horrific, right? It was a bombing. He didn't die immediately. I don't want to go into the gory details, but basically it took a while for him to actually pass from his injuries. And so this is the modus operandi in terms of using a bombing. It's kind of remarkable that, this is something that happened in the 1880s, right? Because we still have those types of scenarios today. But the targets are obviously very, very different. They're going after high-ranking politicians. Now, they didn't always use those types of methods. So if you look at the another famous assassination of a high-ranking Russian official, again, after multiple attempts, it actually happened in Kyiv in 1911. It was another revolutionary that shot the Russian Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin. that was kind of one of the last assassinations prior to the Russian Revolution. And again, the man had multiple attempts on his life. So it's really kind of interesting to compare that to modern Russia, because these people, I mean, I don't know the extent to which they were concerned about collateral damage. Obviously, if they're doing this in a public place, there might be collateral damage, but their goal was to take out politicians, right? So very, very different from going into a concert hall. Again, they're very ideological. It doesn't matter that those people were more like, anti-terrorist or anarchist or whatever their brand of ideology was. They're, of course, mainly left-wing groups, right, that operated in Russia. Of course, not all of them, or most of them, did not use such methods. But this was also just very interesting that I don't know whether Russians would have this as the first thing in their mind, but they certainly are aware of that history of these assassinations, right, of high-ranking politicians by these horrific means, right? And so that idea of terrorism, the fact that it was kind of reborn in the 1990s is, it's fascinating and it's horrifying at the same time to compare those similarities and differences. Where, in the post-Soviet space, you no longer have these. I mean, yes, I'm sure there are attempts on politicians' lives all the time, which is why they have a huge entourage of bodyguards.
There was Lenin itself.
Right.
He suffered attempt to murder, which by the way, it's said that he died because of the lead of the bullet or whatever.
Yeah,
long after.
Yeah, there are lots of theories about that, but yes, of course, that's another example. There's lots of other attempts on various leaders' lives as well. And again, it's sort of limited to politicians. So of course, as we enter the late 20th, the early 21st century, the dynamic changes in terms of causing maximum terror and, in fact, targeting civilian population that is, completely innocent if you think about the children targets. So I think for Russians, it is kind of again, it might not be the very first thing that pops into their mind, but they're obviously, they learn their own history. So of course, they're aware of that long period of a very unstable society with these acts of violence that were being perpetrated. And so the idea that this could happen in any public space was already in the Russian mind back then. And of course, the Soviet Union, the late Soviet Union, was quite a stable society. So to have that, dissolution of a huge country and then have the emergence or reemergence of terrorism was, of course, an absolutely horrifying prospect. And of course, it was much, much worse because the targets were, hostages in a theater, hostages in a school. Another one that was one of the earlier ones.
Civilians.
Yeah, it was civilians. There was another one early on. I think it was. Let me check. It was 1995. It was a hospital. It was sort of the first Chechen war. So this was Yeltsin, right? So we know that Yeltsin was a darling of the Western establishment. So his handling of the Chechen wars was probably perceived better than Putin's handling of the Chechen wars, even though on a grand scale, those two were not, different conflicts, right? So, I'm just checking what the death toll was 129 in this Budenovsk hospital hostage crisis. Again, it was a hostage crisis, and the wounded exceeded 400. So in all of these major attacks, right, the hospital crisis, the theater, right, the 2002 theater hostage crisis in Moscow, and the Beslan school siege, there was sort of one main mastermind, right? His name was Shamil Basayev. He was kind of like one of the intellectual, ideological thought leaders of sort of the Chechen wars. And, I think, again, we've discussed the subject before, but it's important to mention that there were, in both wars, but especially in the Second Chechen War, there were militants from dozens of countries operating in Chechnya. So in a way, it was almost like this proto-Syrian scenario. It wasn't just like, Chechens are seeking to be free, right? Which is, of course, what these days the West would like to portray that crisis as. And if you go on our favorite resource, the Wikipedia, you'll see that even this man who masterminded multiple hostage attacks with hundreds of deaths of women and children. He is either at worst he is described maybe as a separatist, but of course sometimes he's described as a freedom fighter, which says a lot about moderate, like moderate rebels in Syria would be sort of a more recent example of that type of verbiage being used. So in all of those cases, though, this man, as horrible as he was very ideological, and he had very particular demands about the operations of the Russian military in the Chechen republics, right, in the North, or the North Caucasus at large. So again, coming back to the, Crocus City Hall, very, very different, no demands. Going back to the 19th century, even those terrorists, right, those left-wing terrorists that would carry out attacks on high-ranking government officials, all the way to the Tsar, right, Prime Minister, the Tsar, their demands had to do with the political system in Russia. So it's not like, obviously, they were not holding those politicians hostage, but the very act itself was meant to bring attention to their cause, right, and to basically highlight what they perceive to be social inequalities, blah, 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 social change that, paradoxically, Alexander II was the man that actually ended serfdom. He was actually the reformer, but in their opinion, he didn't go far enough. So it's really kind of interesting that he was actually trying to reform the autocratic system in Russia, but some of these more radical groups thought it was grossly insufficient. So in those cases, it was like to make a political statement, to bring attention to their cause. In the 1990s, early 2000s, it was to make very specific demands about the actions of, the Russian army in the North Caucasus. And bam, we're in 2024, no demands. Again, like which is what we started at this episode with, right? Just
nothing.
It's just terror, just massacre.
Yeah, it's the interesting part as well. The 20th century or 21st century terrorism has changed a little bit from, as you say, people with real demands and real ideology behind and balls. Let's put balls on that, because shooting a Tsar is not easy, or whatever, murdering or bombing a Tsar is not easy, or a head of state. But innocent people, it's not very hard. And apart from the upsetting of people and the destruction of families, what good does it do for any cause? Except enraging people against the cause. That's the main thing. You can make several parallels with NGOs that defend some causes, like good causes like feminism or racism and everything like that. You can make good parallels with some NGOs that it just looked like they operate to destroy the cause much more than to reinforce it, by reinforcing too much. And again, complaining too much comes to my mind. And I wanted to understand more. I have a new favorite font, which source, which is Google Gemini. It's very interesting, actually. And
it's like a chat
GPT.
Yeah.
It's a GPT kind of chat, but sponsored by Google, and it also uses recent search, so it's slightly more updated than ChatGPT. And of course, as a good GPT and good Google product, it's extremely biased. And
did you ask it the question?
So the question that I asked was basically what were the terrorists, the Russian attacks in Russia, terrorist attacks in Russia in the last 40 years. And he gave me a good list, a big list. And in the end, it's very interesting, this list, because in 2022, then he mentions the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, considered by many as an act of terrorism from the state of Russia. That's, you have to put that on your list so we can discuss.
No other military actions are considered an active
Yeah,
chair,
no, no,
which is
no, no,
really
no.
interesting.
No
Yeah.
Libya, no Syria, no
Hmm.
nothing, no Iraq, nothing. And yeah, it gives a extensive list of, and of course, the main ones are the ones that you have mentioned. What I wanted to ask you is, as we did some parallels with Paris and
Hmm.
with these past terrorist acts in Russia itself.
Hmm.
How do you see? Do you are you able to make aluminum foil links? I mean, dates. For example, this one it seems like it was programmed to happen just before the election.
Right.
And it was supposed, so the guys were filmed in front of this concert of this Russian superstar, super patriotic star. I
Hmm.
forgot his name.
Shaman.
It's Shaman, exactly. It's not even that hard for me to learn that name. uh, and since the security was extremely high level, it seems like they gave up trying to do on that concert.
Hmm.
And that
So we
would be a
went for
good.
a symphony orchestra. Yeah.
So they
Instead of
went for the easy one. Yeah. Um, so my question would be: Would you make more links to special dates like uh, Russian elections or I don't know, Olympics or World Cup on these other attacks, or were they just somehow pointed to particular wars as the Chechen War or things like that?
Well, the thing is, they used to happen much more frequently. So it would be like in the mid 90s to, let's say, mid 2000s, right? Because the first Chechen War was what, like 94 to 96 ish, and you can't
Hmm.
quite say that it was over, right? It sort of flowed into, there was like a ceasefire, right, and it flowed into the second Chechen War. So 99 2000 up until 2009, actually pretty recently, if you think
Hmm.
about that. And at the time, Russians, or, I don't want to speak for all Russians. I don't know if I thought that Chechnya could really be reintegrated into Russia, considering, if you think about even the legitimacy of carrying out anti-terrorist actions against people coming from dozens of foreign countries like Saudi Arabia. Like, what are you doing in Chechnya? What are you, a Chechen rebel? Um, Very well documented. I mean, even Kadyrov, I know he is a little bit of a clownish persona, but he has that kind of information, right? He talks about it in public all the time. Yeah, so it was kind of difficult to see. Obviously, the destruction from urban warfare is horrifying, right? So
Hmm.
there was obvious damage to the civilian population, especially in the capital of Chechnya and Grozny. But it's pretty amazing to see that we're now in 2024, and Chechens appear to be some of the most patriotic citizens of the Russian Federation, and I don't think it's fake. At least from what I've seen. I mean, obviously you can't speak for every single person living there. It's pretty amazing, and I think it says a lot about those foreign elements and how important they were driving that a military actions, b the ideological features of that conflict. But yeah, anyway, my point is that in that time period, those terrorist attacks were actually much more frequent. So even back then, if you were, you're living abroad, you're, part of the diaspora, people would say, "Are you sure you really want to go and travel because such and such thing has just happened there?" Right? So that was kind of a thought. Whereas more recently, that wasn't really on people's mind. You wouldn't really hear from the Russian diaspora saying, "Oh, maybe you shouldn't travel because there could be something like that happens," in the public space. So I don't know if I would tie them to like the earlier ones to particular dates. I think it's more about the demands, maybe the things that were happening in the war theater at the time, some of the earlier ones. Um, but yeah, this recent one, I mean, definitely, it's kind of hard not to think about the elections because, those warnings from foreign embassies came in early March, right before the elections. They were
Hmm.
very general. If who to believe, right? They're sort of claiming that they passed on all the information to their Russian counterparts. The Russian counterparts say the information was way too general, so it's almost like we get that information all the time. Like this is not not specific enough. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard not to think about the election because it was so close, and it's quite possible that the initial attempts were foiled or they were just too difficult to carry out, which is why the choice was made for a later date. But still kind of in a Russia in a kind of a celebrating phase, right, post-elections. At least that situation has been settled. They knew who the leader would be. They kind of know what the direction of the country would be, generally speaking. And of course, people going to, a symphony orchestra performance are not expecting, well, not that anyone is expecting this kind of thing, but of course, something like that somewhere, outside of Moscow, it's really just not something that would enter their mind, right? So yeah, it's quite possible that there was that connection, but I can't make a definitive statement on that.
Yeah. Well, if you're walking around in Rio de Janeiro, you're definitely waiting for something like that had to happen.
Right.
But yeah, I think we covered that. I think we have to talk about, which is one thing that called a lot about my attention, was the fact that these people were Tajikis from Tajikistan. And I think we have to make a program to talk about this sometime, the relation between Russia, the former Soviet Union republics, especially the Central Asia ones, with nowadays Russia. I'm sorry.
I'm making you sick over.
Oh my God! The power of internet. It's the 5G.
Internet, right? My cough is making you sick. Very quickly too, right? There's no incubation, no incubation period. This is another conspiracy, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, we can definitely talk about the relationship between the former Central Asian Soviet republics, Kyrgyzstan, right, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. There's always been that issue because those republics are so well. Let's say in the 90s, there was the issue of not just migration that may not have been controlled, and it's still not really controlled. And it's a typical labor migration, much like you would have migration coming from, Central America to the US, but also the issue of illicit substances from Afghanistan, especially during the Afghanistan war, where those illicit substances were being really exported all over the world. And of course, going through Central Asia into Russia is a really easy and the most obvious gateway to do that. Now that the war is over and that the Taliban is in control, it doesn't seem like that's much of an issue anymore, which is another interesting aspect. Now, I haven't looked into the specifics of that, but definitely during the war in Afghanistan, right, that lasted for over 15 years, more than that, right? There was that problem of the flow of illicit substances through Central Asia, so Afghanistan, let's say Tajikistan, and then into Russia. And of course, the problem there is that the borders are open or semi-open because of various trade agreements. So of course, when you have certain kinds of trade agreements that are beneficial to the economy, you also have a flow of people that are coming to large Russian cities to work. Again, it's typical labor migration, it's menial labor, but of course they're making much more money. So there's definitely that aspect of how much should that migration be controlled. And, when you have that type of migration, again, you could say most people are literally trying to make money, right? They're making money for their families because they're not living well where their home is. But of course, when you have such a large flow of people, by definition, there are going to be some elements, right, that are not the nicest people. That's just going to happen. And so how do you protect, the country to which there's that large migration flow comes into? Like, what do you do about that? So yeah, I think it's a separate but related discussion. It's definitely an issue, and it's one of those issues that to a certain extent, I would say it resonates in Russian society, but I would also say that the Western media exploits it because they really like to amplify these possible ethno-cultural tensions, and they're not really looking at it for what it is. they're looking at it to create some kind of strife between Russians, which of course Russians are also multi-ethnic, but let's say Slavic Russians versus some of these migrants coming from Central Asia. But yes, it's, if I had to make sort of one qualifying statement, it's definitely been somewhat of a problem because of the way the Russian government has been dealing with it over the years, and it has not been resolved. So yeah, for sure, I think the fact that some of these people had passports, right, coming from that area, obviously highlighted this question. And I've literally, by looking at our favorite source, Wikipedia, and then going onto the citation from the BBC, et cetera, that particular topic is definitely being highlighted of, Russia is now going to persecute these minorities coming from Central Asia. So they definitely have a particular angle when they're covering this topic. So, if I wanted to put on a tinfoil hat, that would be another question of like, why was it people from these places that were hired to as perpetrators of this horrific terrorist act? Was there also this connection to increase, inter-ethnic strife in Russia because of something so horrible, right? This is, kind of an obvious, even though a tinfoil hat interpretation. So, yeah.
Very interesting now that you mentioned that. I've seen these days, I don't know if you see this, some news that the Russian government is being extraditing illegal migrants inside Russia. I don't know if you saw that. Some here and there images of a lot of people being extradited.
Well, they're not being extradited. I saw news that they're being sort of searched as part of this investigation. Now, to what extent this was being carried out and to what extent it's to, some Westerners would say it's to appease the Russian public that might be, very angry by, obviously justifiably so, by this horrific terrorist act. And so I think this is something we can discuss separately as part of another topic, but it's definitely a related subject. So, definitely a question as to why it was those people that were chosen, that definitely arises. Because again, they don't seem to be very ideological. It's not like they're ideological and they're coming from these Central Asian republics that happen to be, predominantly Muslim, right? It's these people just seem to be, just bare bone migrants, and they're trying to make some money, and they decided to make money in this awful way, right? Yeah. So then, whom does it benefit to hire people from Central Asian republics and then publish all these headlines about the oppression, quote unquote, right, of these minorities in Russia, right? Again, I think the question of whom does this benefit can be asked in many ways about this particular act of terrorism and the overall situation around it as well.
Yeah, the tinfoil hat tells me that someone is trying to export xenophobia as well.
Possibly, quite possibly, yeah. But we can definitely discuss this because, again, the Russian government hasn't done the best job of dealing with that situation. Like, how do you deal with open borders markets or partially open borders, I guess, versus the flow of people that would come with it? Mm-hmm. And like I said earlier, it was the issue of illicit substances. Now, as you could see, well, maybe not now, maybe in the last couple of decades as well, that the question of any other kinds of illicit things that could be shipped across open borders, right? That's also that also is problematic. So that's definitely something that is going to open another and has opened a discussion in Russia. But I think we can wrap it up at this point. I think we can do this as kind of like a separate subject.
Yeah, perfect.
You guys want us to know? Do you want us?
Reach 1 hour.
Do you want us? Yeah. Do you guys want us to talk about the relationship between Russia and the former Soviet republics in Central Asia, or we could go back to passion?
Write down on the comments.
I'm always up for that.
Yeah, write down on the comments if you like. So if you like the video, remember to like. If you don't like the video, don't put the like. If you want to comment and something that we said that you think it's wrong, please comment on the comments. If you want to see another video about the Soviet republics, the former Soviet republics relations with modern Russia, write on the comments, share, subscribe to our channels. And if you like, also, you can always find our work The links are on the description. In my channel, you can find the heart. In Nina's, do you already have the heart?
The heart? No, I don't have a heart yet.
The
I'm not
monetized
popular.
channel. Oh, you're getting there. You're getting there.
I will get there. I'll get to my million.
Which, by the way, we have to celebrate that today is our 10th program. So,
oh yes, absolutely.
out of boy for us.
So not only are we not celebrating NATO's birthday, we're also celebrating our 10th program. There we go.
Yeah.
Happy
and we already
birthday.
have some comments on the chat saying that definitely they want to see about Russia, Central Asia from Da Costa Music, one of our subscribers. Nina,
perfect.
Nice to see you again.
Again, apologize for coughing all you guys. Hopefully I didn't get you sick. I'll be better next time, hopefully, fingers crossed. And we will see you soon. Thank you for watching. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.